Now, over the following 30 minutes, we will get to hear more about the clean energy landscape at a global and at a regional level. As we all know, there are major key economy players that are withdrawing from the Paris Agreement and others more towards this region that are emerging as global clean energy powerhouses. So I presume that the main question we need to ask ourselves is what is the direction that we are heading into and what more can we do? This topic of discussion is going to be covered as a keynote speech by Gauri Jauhar, whom is the Executive Director of Integrated Solutions at IHS Markit's Energy Consulting Team, covering Asia and the Middle East. Gauri specializes in financial and operational competitor benchmarking, gas pricing, market entry strategies, and clean energy policy development. She also leads the Energy-Wide Perspectives team in India and mentors numerous researchers across the energy value chain. Without further ado, let's welcome Gauri to the stage, please.
Hello, everybody. A very good morning. Thank you very much for giving IHS Markit the opportunity to present at this Clean Energy Business Council-led forum. I have my colleagues Jeff Warr and Karen Logue also here with me, who lead all our engagements across the MENA region. We will be here today, so we'd be happy to follow up on any discussions also you would like to have. Just a quick thing. I use this, right, to move. Okay, right, thanks. So the objective of this presentation is really to have a global view on clean energy. And the global view on clean energy includes what the clean energy sector is doing, but also what the fossil fuel sector is trying to do to sort of change its stripes, if you will. In terms of our coverage as a company, we work across 34 countries with over 130 offices. We serve about 85% of the global Fortune 500 companies. We work on several consulting, research, data-related projects, and some of you already work with us. So we have a huge depth and breadth of coverage across the energy spectrum. In addition, we serve about 11 core industrial sectors, which range from energy, automotive, chemicals, financial markets, maritime, digital solutions, technology, and also economics and country risk. So it's really bringing to bear, what 15,000 colleagues do globally here. We're going to give you a glimpse of that through this presentation. So really getting into the topic, the state of climate mitigation and efforts to combat global warming. Dr. Saidi talked about the energy transition in his remarks. And I think this is a term that has really come into our language, our new language for energy, really in the last 5 to 7 years. If you look back, when the last oil price crash happened around 2008-9, nobody really talked about an energy transition. And I think this is related to, waking up to the climate reality, waking up to the fact that the energy transition affects everybody. It affects us as consumers, it affects us as producers, no matter which part of the energy value chain we are in. And energy transitions are not new. They have happened globally in the past. They've happened when we moved from being a wood-burning society to, into the oil world, later into the gas world. So energy transitions per se are not new. However, what is new this time is the driver for that energy transition. In the past, energy transitions have happened because of better functionality of fuels, higher energy content of fuels. Today, the energy transition is an industry response to the climate change reality. And it is being shaped by governmental policies. It is being shaped by societal pressures, by changes in consumer behavior. Consumers want a different solution, technological challenges, and of course, geopolitics. It will affect investment flows, and I think this is something also Dr. Saidi referred to. And it will also change business models in fundamental ways, both for clean energy companies, but also for the existing fossil fuel companies. In IHS Market, we look at the long term right up to 2050, wherein we see what are those broad changes and drivers for change that are happening. And we really have, if you will, three worldviews. And one of the first worldviews we have is what we call the rivalry view, where we believe there is an inter-fuel and inter-energy source rivalry that is just natural to the energy spectrum, where, based on the economics and technologies, people make alternative choices. What we see is if you go right up to 2050, the green line, which is natural gas, gas actually grows more than any other individual energy source. It goes right up from 23 percentage points to about 27 percentage points, overtaking oil and definitely by far overtaking coal in the fossil fuel mix. So gas is the cleanest fossil fuel. It still has methane emission problems, but in terms of CO2 emissions, it is half of the coal-related CO2 emissions. What is key to this scenario is that it's more a business as usual scenario. So if we go on a business as usual basis, we see that renewables quadruples actually from about 2% to about 9% in the primary energy mix. But what this underscores is that if we go in a business as usual world, we will not reach where we want to reach as a society in terms of lowering emissions by lowering emissions and working towards a scenario where the global change in temperatures is below 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees centigrade. If we go towards a faster transition scenario, is what we call the autonomy scenario. This is a scenario which is really led by technological change and significant government policy pressure acting to change company investments and consumer choices. What we see in that scenario, which is, I think, the world which we are actually aspiring towards, is that oil demand plateaus pretty soon, actually, by about 2026. And different oil products may plateau at different time, but overall oil demand plateaus in 2026. We see gas demand still about stable at about 23, 24 percentage points. But what's most interesting is that we see renewables surpasses coal by the mid-2040s and has the fastest trajectory in terms of growth from 2 percentage points to 18 percentage points. This is the world which I think we are here to discuss today. This is the world which needs to happen. But actually the world of rivalry is where things need to be pushed far more. So if we do not bring about that radical change, what we believe is if we look at our scenarios, again, the historical view, rivalry, autonomy, and the 2 degrees centigrade scenario, the blue and yellow lines correspond to the energy mix of the last two scenarios, and the dotted red line is the 2 degree centigrade line. Our emissions profile and energy-related CO2 emissions profile is nowhere close to what is needed to achieve the 2 degrees scenario, and definitely not the 1.5 degree scenario. So radical change is really what is needed because, as we Dr. Saidi also mentioned, there are financial knock-on effects that we may begin to see. There are physical security risks, insurance risks, which we may also begin to see. So, going from that global view of the energy mix into really what is the strategies of these, big oil, big energy companies, which have been the deep pockets of the energy industry for a very long time. These 8 companies, in the international oil and gas company, energy company sphere, really represent, they're the bellwethers of this industry. And what's interesting is that in the last 10 years, they've begun to change their stripes. And how have they begun to do that? They are following about 13 different strategies. The green is where those companies have definitely made a move in that direction. Yellow is they're making certain moves. White is white space. They haven't made any moves. And what's interesting here is that at the very top, it is about reducing direct operational emissions. So this again points towards the efficiency argument that how can I make whatever I do today, I'm making oil and gas, I am delivering petrol in petrol pumps, how can I make that more efficient? So what we're seeing there is you have companies, for instance, where I'm coming from in India, which have solarized their gas stations. So they are still delivering oil and gas, petrol, but they have solarized their petrol pumps. So they've changed their source of energy to a cleaner source of energy while delivering oil and gas. Similarly, if you look at companies like BP, they are putting fuel cells at their wellheads. So it is about taking the current operation and making it cleaner. That's sort of the low-hanging fruit. The second one, which I think the industry consistently is doing, is promoting natural gas and LNG into newer markets of transportation, also into gas and renewable integration, that as renewables picks up in the energy mix, in the power mix, you need something to support the intermittency and variability that comes with renewables. Until battery storage really reaches, material commercial levels, there is a play for gas renewable integration to happen. And we're seeing some of the majors really working on that. A lot of them are coming back to solar. We saw BP exiting solar in the early 2000s. They're coming back to solar, back to wind, biofuels, to really impact the transportation mix. Some are doing efforts in geothermal, hydropower, EVs, carbon capture, utilization and storage, and also nature-based solutions, really building large carbon sinks. What's interesting is what this total effort points to is we're seeing about $8 billion of annual capex that these companies are, committing to these new energies, which represents about 5% of their total corporate capex. And we believe this trend will last at least till the next 2-3 years, and we'll probably see only an intensification of this trend, because they have shareholders asking them to also change their business models. So there is a financial and shareholder pressure also acting on them. So what is the global state of the renewable clean energy and decarbonization? If we see all the national renewable policy targets in some of the emerging markets across APAC, MENA region, CIS, and Latin America, what we see is the renewable targets in green are the ones in 2017, but then almost all countries, with the exception of China, which has really had a very large target to begin with in terms of percentage renewable in the power mix, everybody's adjusted their targets upwards. So the big white bars shows that target adjustment. So every country is really pushing on the pedal for improving their targets for renewable energy. This is, of course, a large business opportunity, but it points towards a global effort which we see, in the UN Climate Action Summit, or we see in the Paris Agreement, starting with the Paris Agreement of 2015, to understand that local air pollution and climate change are becoming increasingly interlinked. This year, if we see globally, the global tender and contract price ranges, we see new record low renewable tender announcements. Brazil had a solar awarded at 17.5. And also prices for procured renewable energy are continuing to fall. We're seeing France, UK, and Netherlands even moving away from subsidies. These are also countries where carbon taxation is far more prevalent than in many other parts of the world. China completed its first round of competitive tenders. In India, what we're seeing is that there have been record low tenders, but there are now a slight upward push on the tender prices because there have been some issues on the PPA and non-realization risks in terms of actually being able to honor those contracts. And I think what's most interesting in the United States is that we're seeing gigawatt scale solar and battery projects being also tendered out. This is going to be challenging gas in the long term. What does this all add up to? So we believe that if you look at coal, gas, other conventionals, and renewables is in the green, coal is in the black, and gas is in the gray. Renewables will account for 73% of the new power gen capacity added globally, and it will become the dominant source of new generation, new additions. Except in India, we do see coal still being quite a mainstay because coal is still a very important part of the political economy and a source of jobs, a source of wealth creation in India. Having said that, there is a pause on new coal power-based projects being awarded in India. So what is in the pipeline is getting built out. But there is a pause on new plants being awarded, and plants also being more efficient now, so the new plants are all supercritical. On average, what does this translate into the global electricity mix? So we have two colors here. One is the color of the maps, which is a graded blue. The darker the blue, the higher the global renewable energy power penetration by 2050. And the charts show the net additions of renewables versus conventionals. So what we see is, the dark blues are really in Europe. We see some more higher penetrations in parts of North Africa, Middle East, China, Australia. But what's also interesting is that where is coal really going down? And we see that happening in China. Though China will still be a very large consumer of coal, we see that happening in Europe. We see that also happening in North America, despite the current administration sort of, move back somewhat to coal. But what's worrying is that we see India and Asia Pacific still powering ahead with coal because these are countries where still there is a whole argument which is made on energy justice, that till the countries develop and till the countries really increase their per capita incomes, how can we take away coal? We can't take away coal overnight. So it's about cleaning the mix and bringing renewables as a hybrid form of energy. In terms of, what is that technological evolution, we conducted a set of asset owner interviews, and what we see is up to 2025, across the wind and solar spectrums, there will be some evolutionary rather than revolutionary progress made. There are a lot of pilots out there on the far end, which is the long term through 2035, for new technologies which point in the direction of higher efficiency of solar and wind. So on wind, it's about bringing in more floating offshore wind, airborne wind, renewable energy used for non-power generation use, using, for instance, to make hydrogen, using renewable energy to make hydrogen, what we call the power 2X, or in solar, new cell concepts like tandem, multi-junction, and perovskite, and other printable PVs. These all point towards bringing higher efficiencies, but these higher efficiencies also come at much higher costs. So by the time the cost curve can really come down, we're probably looking at a period beyond 2035. So what is the role of, this really points all to the power and the electricity generation mix. What is really the role of clean mobility in the global energy transition? So we believe if you look at the base case, the business as usual scenario even, despite all the push towards electric vehicles that is happening, and notwithstanding maybe higher push towards electric vehicles that can happen, we believe that actually it's fuel economy standards and not electric vehicles which will have the biggest downward impact on oil demand. So by 2050, about 20 million barrels of oil demand a day will be decreased because of higher fuel economy standards. And only an additional 8 million barrels will be because of a decrease related to electric vehicles. This, of course, can change if governments push much harder on electric vehicles, if electric vehicles become much cheaper, also based on incentives. So what is the IHS view on market view on energy transitions? So there are three really broad indicators of energy transition. One is the degree of renewables penetration in the electricity generation, the electricity share of total transportation energy demand, and electricity in the final energy mix. And what we see is electricity in the final energy mix is the most important driver for the energy transition. It is in the range of about 20%, which is reached by 2018. Renewables in electricity generation is still, in the sub 10% level. Electricity share of total transportation energy demand is still at about 2 percentage points. However, what really needs to be acted upon far more is that the biggest source of the energy transition, which is electricity, is the emissions intensity is falling much slower than what is needed. So we need to really clean out that power mix far more to reduce the emissions intensity. Moving on from solar and wind, batteries is the next sort of wave, if you will, of what needs to support the intermittency and variability of higher degree of wind and solar in the mix. And what we see is that this is the Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, which is a very important part of the North American system, US system, generator reliability attribute mix. So the generators look at about 13 attributes for the reliability of the system. And in the choice set, to balance that increasing renewables, we see two options really of gas turbines and battery storage. And if you see the right across, the full or the half circles indicate the ability of that particular energy source to meet that reliability standard of the generator. We see gas is actually able to do that far more than batteries. So gas has only one, in terms of the on-site fuel inventory, which it doesn't meet. But if you look at battery and storage, there are still 3 more areas out of 13 attributes that it still has to overcome. And of course, the cost element as well. The other new trend, which is actually coming back also because of a push by the current US administration, is carbon capture project activity. And this is partly linked to cleaning up the coal mix, but it is also linked to utilizing current CO2 into the, for instance, for enhanced oil recovery projects to increase the utilization of CO2 which is captured. We have had some historical projects, if you look at in Norway, where old oil fields like the Sleipner field actually have been storing that, the CO2. But the next wave is really about utilizing the CO2 and actually deriving value out of it. The outlook still is not anywhere in terms of the levels it has to be for a low emissions case. So there are about 35 large projects globally which are currently in progress, and but this really needs to be accelerated, and there is new funding that is definitely coming in this direction. Hydrogen is the next, sort of new frontier in terms of what can happen. I think the hydrogen gets very interesting because there are many different ways to form hydrogen. One is the way it is currently formed, which is, if you look at, this is the European picture where, there's the decentralized end of the spectrum and then there's the centralized end of the spectrum. And right now, it's really about methane reforming with carbon capture and storage to really meet the space heating needs of homes. But in the future, what we believe is hydrogen can be produced in situ by electrolysis, where it can be linked through the power source can be renewables based, and it can enter into the transportation mix, it can enter into industrial mix, and we are seeing, for instance, pilots of hydrogen being mixed with CNG for buses. We are seeing in Leeds in the UK, the old natural gas grids are being looked at as future hydrogen grids as well. However, this is still a new technology, and I must share that, and Karen and Jeff can talk to it more. We have a hydrogen multi-client that we have done across the markets of China, Europe, and the US, and what are the new trends in that. So this is something we could definitely discuss more with you as well. And I think the last aspect is nature-based solutions. This is also in some senses a low-hanging fruit in terms of reforestation, peatland restorations, avoiding peatland impacts, the kind we are seeing in Scotland happening right now, where there's a lot of CO2 emissions which are just going because of peatland fires. So nature-based solutions is again, something we see companies like Shell really investing in it. So you're seeing the impact of big energy companies going back into this. So what is really now coming to your region, which I think you know much better than I would, overview of the state of clean energy and renewables in the MENA region. When we look at all the trends happening in the next, over the next decade, what we see is really the share of Middle East gains ground. So what we see is Saudi Arabia goes from really being 1% in the renewables installed capacity to 20%. We see the UAE footprint growing from 8% to 15%. We see Egypt also growing. We see Morocco as well growing. So there's definitely a Middle East starts taking a much higher share in the MENA region. In terms of types of technology, we see solar PV gaining ground here at the expense of wind and to some extent CSPs. In terms of, what type of, is it distributed or centralized, we're looking at large utility tenders here. And if you will, 2018-19 is sort of the high water mark where you're really transitioning into a much higher gigawatt scale. I think there's an increased clarity on renewable energy strategies with government targets and government commitments to first large-scale tenders. So really, it'll be about the implementation of these large-scale projects which will be looked upon. But if you go back into the early 2000s, there were no real national targets being set, and it was very much at discussion stage. So at that point, that ends our presentation here, and happy to discuss more with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Gauri. I think that it's very clear that business as usual is not a solution, and we all need radical transformation in order to achieve the ambitious targets. But definitely the countries in this region are raising their ambition levels when it comes to renewable energy. It has become an integral part of government agendas.